She was at my wedding. She held my hand when I miscarried. She sat with my children when I worked late. She was the first person I called when my marriage started falling apart. And while I was on the phone crying to her, she was already sleeping with my husband. She took $341,000 from me. She took my marriage. She turned my own children against me. She had me sent to a psychiatric ward. And the whole time, she never stopped smiling. My name is Carol, and I need you to hear what happened to me. Because the woman who did this, I loved her. For 20 years, I loved her like a sister. And that is exactly why she chose me. Before we go any further, I want you to drop everything and really sit with what you are about to hear. Because this story did not happen in a dark alley. It did not happen between strangers. It did not happen in some distant city to people you would never know. This happened in a kitchen, at a dinner table, in a church pew, between two women who had been best friends since they were 12 years old. And if you think you would have seen it coming, I want you to stay with me until the very end, because every single person in Carol's life thought exactly the same thing. They were all wrong. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Carol grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the daughter of a factory worker and a part-time housekeeper. She was the kind of child who did not have the luxury of dreaming too big. So she learned early that the only way forward was through hard work, discipline, and loyalty. By the time she was in high school, she was already working after school, saving money, keeping meticulous notes. Her teachers called her driven. Her classmates called her responsible. And Carol would later say, with a quiet kind of sadness, that those qualities, the very things that made her exceptional, were the exact things that made her a perfect target. She met Diane in the fall of 1983 in a 7th grade classroom in a suburb just outside Dayton. They were assigned seats 2 rows apart. By the end of that first school year, they were inseparable. By high school, they finished each other's sentences. They cried together over boys, over family problems, over the kinds of small devastations that feel enormous when you are 15. And as the years passed and the devastations grew larger, they cried together over those too. They were maids of honor at each other's weddings. They were present in the delivery rooms when each other's children were born. When Carol's first pregnancy ended in a miscarriage at 4 months, Diane drove 3 hours to be with her and did not leave for 4 days. That was the kind of friendship this was. Deep, unconditional, and in Carol's eyes, completely permanent. Diane was different from Carol in ways that, in their youth, seemed complementary rather than concerning. Where Carol was quiet and methodical, Diane was magnetic. She walked into rooms and made everyone feel immediately seen. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday, who brought food when someone was sick, who could make a stranger feel like an old friend within 10 minutes of conversation. People were drawn to her the way people are drawn to warmth on a cold day. And for 20 years, Carol felt nothing but grateful to be the person Diane loved most. Carol married a man named Mark in 1994. He worked in corporate logistics management, a steady, unspectacular career that suited his steady, unspectacular personality. They built a comfortable life in a suburb of Dayton. They had 2 children, a son named Jason and a daughter named Michelle. Carol ran her own small bookkeeping business out of her home office, serving the kind of local small businesses that form the invisible backbone of every American city, the family-owned hardware stores, the insurance offices, the medical billing operations. She was excellent at her work. Her clients trusted her completely. By her mid-40s, she had built something she was genuinely proud of. And in the spring of 2017, because the idea felt natural and obvious and right, she asked Diane to become her business partner. Diane had spent years working in marketing at a regional advertising firm. She had always talked about wanting something of her own, something that bore her name, something she had actually built. When Carol offered her the partnership, Diane wept. She told Carol it was the most meaningful professional gesture anyone had ever made toward her. She said she would never forget it. She said she would spend the rest of her career making Carol proud. Carol believed every word of it because she had no reason not to. She had known this woman for 34 years. She had watched her be a good mother, a generous neighbor, a faithful friend. So when Diane suggested that her attorney friend review the partnership agreement before they signed, Carol did not ask for a second review. She did not sit alone with the document for a night and read every line. She signed where she was told to sign, Because this was Diane, and trust, after 34 years, had long since replaced caution. That partnership agreement gave Diane full co-equal access to every business account. Every single one. And that single act of love and confidence, the simple act of trusting her best friend with the keys to everything she had built, would eventually cost Carol more than she could have imagined the day she picked up the pen. The first year of the partnership looked like success. New clients came in. Revenue grew. Carol managed the books with her usual precision. Diane handled marketing with the natural charm she had always carried. They had lunch together 3 times a week. They texted every morning. Carol would tell anyone who asked that going into business with her best friend was the best decision she had ever made. But underneath the surface of that first year, in account ledgers Carol had not yet scrutinized closely enough, something had already begun. The first transaction Carol later could not explain appeared in the spring of 2018. A vendor payment for just over $400, made to a company Carol had never heard of, for services she could not identify. When she mentioned it to Diane, Diane laughed. She pulled out her phone. She explained it away. She called it the graphic design consultation they had discussed back in January. And when Carol said she did not remember that discussion, Diane said, "Carol, you have been so busy. I probably mentioned it, and it went right past you." Carol made a note, filed it, moved on. That was exactly what Diane was counting on. What came next is important to understand properly, because it is the part that people find most difficult to accept when they first hear it. The theft that Diane was running was not messy. It was not the desperate scrambling of a person in financial crisis making reckless mistakes. It was structured, patient, and deliberate in a way that investigators would later describe in court documents as sophisticated and methodical. She varied the amounts so no single transaction stood out. She spread transfers across multiple vendor accounts, some legitimate, some entirely fabricated. She timed the larger movements to coincide with the busiest periods in the business calendar, the times when Carol would be most focused on client work and least likely to conduct a close review of the accounts. She used the language of ordinary business operations to dress her fraud in the clothing of routine, and she did all of it while sitting across from Carol at their shared desk, bringing her coffee every morning, asking about her children, and being, by every visible measure, exactly who she had always been. By December of 2018, 18 months after the partnership began, Diane had quietly moved $63,000 out of the business accounts through a combination of inflated invoices, payments to shell companies she had set up under names that sounded plausible, and direct transfers to a personal account Carol did not know existed. $63,000, and Carol had not seen a single transaction that made her feel certain something was wrong. That is the terrifying reality of being defrauded by someone you love completely. The alarm bells that would ring deafening in the presence of a stranger sound almost reasonable when they come in the voice of a friend. In June of 2019, Carol's husband Mark received a significant promotion at work. It came with a new title, a salary increase, and a new travel schedule that meant he was away from home more frequently than he had ever been before. Carol was proud of him. She threw a small dinner party. Diane came, of course. She sat at the table and raised her glass and toasted Mark with the warmth and ease that she brought to every occasion. Carol watched her best friend toast her husband and felt, in that moment, exactly what she was supposed to feel, which was gratitude for the life she had built and the people in it. What Carol did not know, sitting at that dinner table, was that Diane and Mark had been exchanging private messages for 4 months. The affair had not yet become physical, but the foundation of something that should never have existed was already well under construction. And the person laying that foundation, carefully, quietly, and with the same patience she applied to everything else she did, was smiling across Carol's dinner table with a glass of wine in her hand. Mark's promotion meant more travel, more nights away, more gradual silences building in a marriage that had already been under quiet strain for a year. And into those silences, Diane moved. She began showing up at the house more frequently when Mark was home. She would bring wine on Friday evenings. She started texting Mark directly, always framing the contact as concern for Carol, always presenting herself as the loyal friend checking in on a woman she loved. She told Mark that Carol was stressed, that Carol seemed tired, that Diane was worried about her. She positioned every conversation as an act of devotion to her best friend, which meant that Mark, if he felt anything growing that he should have shut down, had a ready excuse to tell himself it was harmless. It was not harmless. By the late summer of 2019, the affair was no longer theoretical, and it had been going on long enough that both of them had grown comfortable with the deception. Diane had been Carol's best friend for over 3 decades. She knew where every crack in that marriage was. She knew every fear Carol had ever whispered in the dark. She had been given a map to the most vulnerable corners of Carol's life, given freely and with love, and she had used every inch of it. Carol found out on a Tuesday morning in August of 2019. She was walking through her kitchen. Mark had already left for an early flight. His phone was on the counter. She was not checking it, not suspicious, not looking for anything. She was simply moving through her own house on an ordinary morning. The screen lit up. She looked. The message preview was 4 words long. The contact name was Diane. Carol has described the next 45 minutes as the strangest experience of her life. She stood in that kitchen and did not move. She was not crying. She was not shouting. She was simply standing very still in the middle of her life, while something she could not yet name shifted irreversibly beneath it. She called Diane that afternoon. She kept her voice steady. She said, "I need to see you." And Diane said, "Of course, honey. I will bring coffee." She brought coffee. She sat down at Carol's kitchen table, the same table at which she had sat hundreds of times across 20 years of Sundays. And when Carol slid the phone across with the message visible on the screen, Diane cried. Real tears, or what looked like real tears. She said she was sorry. She said it was a mistake, that it was new, that it had not gone anywhere serious. She reached across the table and took both of Carol's hands and said, "You are the most important person in my life, and I mean that with everything that I am." Carol looked into her best friend's face and chose to believe her. That was the last moment of innocence in this story. What followed the confrontation was not the clean break that anyone watching from the outside would have counseled. Mark did not confess fully. He minimized. He framed the relationship with Diane as something that had barely begun and had not yet crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. And Carol, who was exhausted and frightened and not yet ready to lose everything at once, chose to believe the version of events that would let her hold her household together. That decision, as understandable as it was, proved costly. Because while Carol was trying to repair her marriage and process the shock of what she had learned and keep herself functioning for the sake of her children, Diane was continuing to drain the business accounts. In the 3 months following the kitchen table confrontation, she transferred an additional $89,000 out of the business. She did it carefully, in increments, on the same schedule she had been maintaining for 2 years. And Carol, who was watching her marriage instead of her accounts, did not catch it. It was not until October of 2019 that Carol sat down to conduct her regular quarterly review of the business finances and felt the ground move beneath her feet. She had always been meticulous about these reviews. The careful, methodical cross-referencing of every transaction against every invoice was the work she had built her professional reputation on. She was genuinely, exceptionally good at it. So when she sat down that October afternoon and began pulling the accounts, it took her less than 40 minutes to understand that something was catastrophically wrong. She spent the next 3 days pulling 18 months of records, printing statements, building spreadsheets, following every thread she could find. By the end of those 3 days, she had documented a gap of $214,000. Every thread she pulled led to accounts and vendors she had never seen before and never authorized. She called Diane. She kept it a question rather than an accusation. She said she was trying to make sense of some discrepancies, and could Diane walk her through them? And Diane's response was immediate and seamless. She said there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for each item Carol had flagged. She said Carol's stress levels were affecting her ability to read the accounts clearly. She said Carol should consider stepping back from the administrative side for a few weeks while Diane handled things. She said all of this warmly and calmly, and without a single crack of hesitation. Carol later described that phone call as the moment she stopped being confused and started being afraid. Because Diane had not been defensive. She had not stumbled. She had been warm, concerned, and completely, chillingly in control. And something about that total composure, in the face of what Carol had just uncovered, told her something that no amount of prior trust could silence. She called her sister Brenda that same night. Brenda told her to get every document out of the office immediately before Diane had any reason to believe action was coming. Carol drove to the office that evening, copied every record she could access, and within the week had hired a forensic accountant named Patricia, a retired IRS investigator who had spent 2 decades inside the agency's financial crimes unit before going into private practice. Patricia reviewed the documents over a long weekend. She called Carol on Monday morning and told her to sit down. What Patricia found, documented in the report she would eventually file with the court, was not disorganized bookkeeping. It was not a misunderstanding between partners. It was a structured theft scheme in which Diane had used her co-equal account access to route funds through at least 3 separate personal accounts, 2 in her own name and 1 registered to a business entity that had no legitimate operations and no employees. Patricia found loans taken out in Carol's name, using Carol's social security number and her business credentials that Carol had never signed, never authorized, and never once known about. The total, when Patricia completed her audit, was $341,800. Taken over 26 months. One quiet, invisible, patient transaction at a time. Patricia also noted in her report something that chilled Carol when she read it. The transfers had been timed and structured to fall just below the thresholds that trigger automatic bank reporting flags. This was not luck. This was knowledge. This was someone who understood the financial system well enough to move through it without setting off its alarms. Carol went to the police in January of 2020. She walked into her local precinct with a 2-inch folder of documentation and Patricia's full forensic report. She sat across from a detective for nearly 90 minutes and walked him through every transaction, every forged signature, every shell account. At the end of the meeting, the detective told her that what she had described sounded like a civil business dispute and recommended she consult with an attorney. Carol walked out of that precinct building into the cold January air and stood on the sidewalk for a long time. She had handed a detective documented evidence of wire fraud, identity theft, and forgery, and she had been sent home. What Carol did not know yet, what she would only discover months later when the criminal investigation finally opened, was that Diane had visited that same precinct 3 weeks before Carol's appointment. She had filed a report of her own, stating that her business partner Carol had been behaving erratically, making threatening statements, showing signs of significant psychological distress. She had presented herself as a concerned friend who was frightened for Carol's well-being. She had been composed, credible, and entirely convincing. The detective who dismissed Carol had already heard Diane's version of events before Carol walked through the door. This is the part of the story where it becomes important to understand something that researchers who study this kind of betrayal have documented extensively. The financial theft, devastating as it was only one component of what Diane was doing. Running alongside it, for months, had been a quieter and in some ways more insidious operation. Diane had been conducting what could only be described as a deliberate campaign to dismantle Carol's credibility and isolate her from the people who might have believed her. To Carol's son Jason, she had quietly expressed concern that his mother was struggling, that Carol had been saying things that were not quite accurate, that Diane was worried. To women from Carol's church who had known her for over a decade, Diane had hinted that Carol had developed a problem with alcohol. To mutual friends, she had presented herself as a loyal companion doing her difficult best to support a woman who was unfortunately unraveling. Every statement was phrased as concern. Every conversation was framed as love. And because Diane had been a trusted presence in all of these people's lives for years, they believed her. Carol's son Jason began pulling away. The women from church stopped calling. Invitations dried up. Old friends became unavailable. Carol, who was already carrying more than any person should have to carry alone, initially blamed herself. She assumed she was reaching out less. She assumed she was harder to be around. She did not yet understand that she was living inside a campaign that had been designed specifically to make her look unstable at the exact moment she would most need people to trust her. It was only when her next-door neighbor, a woman she had known for 11 years, sat her down in late February of 2020 and said, "Carol, I need to tell you what I have been hearing," that Carol finally began to see the full shape of what had been done to her. And the shape of it was enormous. Diane had not simply stolen from her. Diane had spent months, methodically and patiently, poisoning the well, so that when Carol told the truth, nobody would believe her. In November of 2020, Carol was hospitalized. Her physician documented severe anxiety, acute depression, and significant physical deterioration. She had lost more than 20 pounds in 4 months. She was not sleeping. She was barely eating. She had spent nearly a year fighting on 3 fronts simultaneously, trying to salvage what remained of her marriage, trying to build a legal case that the police had initially refused to take seriously, and trying to understand why her community was disappearing around her. The hospitalization lasted 8 days. On the 3rd day, Diane walked through the door. She came with flowers and tears. She held Carol's hand. She spoke to the nurses with warmth and familiarity. She told Carol's daughter Michelle that she would be there no matter what, that true friendship did not abandon someone in their worst moments, that she loved Carol and always would. Michelle, 24 years old and grieving the collapse of her parents' marriage, was moved watching Diane in that hospital room. She later said she cried. She genuinely believed what she was seeing. What no one in that hospital room knew at the time, what would only emerge when investigators pulled the financial records months later, was that on the same day Diane walked through that hospital door with flowers, she had initiated a wire transfer from the business account. $87,000. The single largest transfer in the entire 26-month scheme. She had moved the money while Carol was lying in a hospital bed, and then she had driven to the hospital and held Carol's hand and wept. This story has a real-world parallel that will help you understand that what happened to Carol was not an isolated aberration. In 2008, Shania Twain, one of the most successful country music artists in American history, discovered that her husband of 14 years had been having an affair with her closest friend and personal assistant, the woman she called her confidant, the woman she had trusted with her home, her schedule, her marriage. When Shania noticed her husband's behavior changing and felt the creeping unease of a marriage shifting in ways she could not explain, she went to her best friend for reassurance. She said to her, "Do you notice anything strange about how he has been acting?" And her best friend looked her in the eye and said no. She said no while the affair was already well underway. She held Shania's concern in her hands, the trust of a woman who was frightened and confused and looking to the person she relied on most for the truth, and she handed it back to her as a lie. Shania has said publicly that the experience left her in a state of psychological devastation that took years to fully work through. She lost her voice, literally, developing a medical condition called dysphonia in the aftermath, a physical manifestation of the trauma her body could not contain. She said she was ready to die from the grief of it, not from losing the husband, from losing the friend. Because the friend, she said, was the deeper wound. Carol understood that perfectly. When investigators finally made contact with a woman named Susan, a 51-year-old woman in Tennessee who had been Diane's closest friend for 6 years before Carol, the pattern became undeniable. Susan had run a small catering business. Diane had become involved in a supporting capacity. Over approximately 18 months, nearly $60,000 had disappeared from Susan's business accounts through a pattern of transactions that Patricia, when she reviewed them as a supplement to the main case, said was structurally almost identical to what had been done to Carol. Same approach, same timing, same insulation through warmth and closeness. Susan had not pursued criminal charges. She had been too ashamed, too thoroughly confused by Diane's account of events at the time, to fully understand what had happened until investigators called her. Carol was not Diane's first. Carol was simply the largest target Diane had ever chosen. And she had chosen her for the same reason every predator chooses a trusted victim. Because the closer you are, the harder it is to see clearly. And the harder it is to see, the longer you can take. Carol was discharged from the hospital in mid-November of 2020. She went home to a house that felt emptied out in ways that went beyond furniture. Mark had moved out in September, and the divorce proceedings, though not yet formally filed, were effectively already decided. Jason was still distant. Michelle was trying, quietly, from a distance. And Carol was alone in a way that she had not been since long before she was 12 years old, and sat down 2 rows away from the girl who would become her best friend and her undoing. But something happened in that aloneness. In the stripped-down quiet of a life that had been taken apart piece by piece, something in Carol shifted. She stopped grieving and started preparing. The change was not dramatic. It was a Tuesday morning. A cup of coffee. A legal pad. A decision. She called Patricia again. She asked Patricia to reconstruct the audit specifically around the elements that constituted criminal fraud rather than civil dispute, organized to be presented to a financial crimes investigator rather than a general detective. And she asked her sister Brenda if she knew anyone who could connect her with a financial crimes unit outside her local precinct, somewhere Diane's narrative had not already arrived ahead of her. Brenda's contact led Carol to a detective named Sandra, a financial crimes investigator in a neighboring county with over 15 years of experience in exactly this category of case. Carol drove to Sandra's office on a Thursday afternoon in December of 2020 and handed over everything. Sandra reviewed Patricia's report over 2 days. She called Carol on a Friday afternoon and said, plainly and directly, "What is in this report is not a civil dispute. This is wire fraud. This is identity theft. This is forgery. And it is one of the more thorough financial crimes perpetrated by a private individual against a personal associate that I have seen in my career. We are opening a formal investigation." Carol sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes after hanging up the phone. She did not feel triumphant. She simply cried, quietly, for the first time in months, in a way that felt like something releasing rather than something building. The investigation ran for 8 months. What investigators uncovered went considerably further than even Carol had fully known. They traced the shell accounts Diane had been using and found that 2 of them had been opened in a city in Florida, nearly 1,200 miles from Dayton. The Florida account was connected to a financial advisor whose name appeared nowhere in Carol's business records, but whose number appeared repeatedly in Diane's phone records during the period of heaviest theft. Investigators concluded that Diane had not simply been spending stolen money on personal luxuries, though she had done some of that too. She had been moving it, staging it, placing it in accounts designed to be difficult to trace quickly. She had anticipated, from relatively early in the scheme, that the theft would eventually be discovered, and she had built herself a way out. But investigators also found Susan. And Susan's story meant that everything Diane had done to Carol was not an impulsive act born of opportunity or desperation. It was a method. She had done it before. She had refined it. She had come to Carol not simply as a friend, but as a professional predator who had already practiced on someone else and learned from every mistake. Diane was arrested on a Wednesday morning in September of 2021. She was at home when the investigators arrived. Neighbors who witnessed the arrest later said the thing that struck them most was how composed she appeared. She walked out of her house in a pressed blazer, her hair neat, her expression measured, as though she were stepping out to attend a meeting. There was no visible panic, no tears, no breaking of the composure she had maintained through everything. Even at the moment of her arrest, with investigators on her doorstep and handcuffs in their hands, the performance held. She was charged with 4 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of aggravated identity theft, 1 count of forgery, and 2 counts of financial exploitation. Her attorney entered a not guilty plea at arraignment. And from that moment forward, Diane's defense was precisely what Carol had anticipated. The defense argued that Carol had been a full and knowing participant in every financial decision the partnership had made. That the transfers were legitimate business expenses Carol had either approved or failed to adequately monitor as the senior partner. That Carol's current allegations were the product of a documented mental health crisis, evidenced by her own hospitalization records, combined with the bitterness of a woman whose marriage had fallen apart and who was looking for a place to direct her anger. It was the same story Diane had been telling for 2 years. She had simply moved it from neighborhood whisper campaigns into a federal courtroom. The trial lasted 9 days. For the first 4 of those days, the defense worked its strategy with real skill. Diane's attorney was experienced and precise. He used Carol's hospitalization records to raise questions about her reliability as a witness. He found former business contacts willing to testify that Carol had been difficult to reach during a certain period, which was technically true and entirely misleading. There were moments in the middle of that trial when Carol's daughter, Michelle, sitting in the gallery watching, was genuinely frightened about where things were heading. Then Patricia took the stand. Patricia had spent 20 years inside the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit before going into private practice, and she brought that 2 decades of institutional authority into that courtroom with her. She did not use emotional language. She did not tell stories. She walked the jury through the numbers with the quiet, relentless precision of someone who had done exactly this kind of work for the entirety of her professional life. She explained how the transactions had been timed. She explained the structure of the shell account system. She explained, in language every juror could follow, that the pattern of transfers was consistent with a deliberate, premeditated scheme and with nothing else. She used the words deliberate and premeditated 4 times. She said them calmly and let the math speak for itself. Then the prosecution introduced the phone records. On the day Diane had walked into Carol's hospital room with flowers and tears and prayers, the records showed 4 phone calls to the financial advisor in Florida. The calls lasted a combined 38 minutes. The wire transfer of $87,000 was initiated 3 hours after the last call ended. And 2 hours after the transfer cleared, Diane drove to the hospital. She brought flowers. She held Carol's hand. She told the nurses how much she loved her. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 14 minutes. Guilty, on all counts. Diane was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison and ordered to repay $341,800 in restitution. She showed no visible reaction when the verdict was read. She looked straight ahead, composed to the end. As of this video, Carol has received $12,000 of the court-ordered restitution. The federal system has mechanisms for collecting restitution payments, but the practical reality for financial crime victims is that the full amount is rarely recovered on schedule and often never recovered in full. Carol knows this now. She carries it the way she carries many of the things that came out of this chapter of her life, not with rage, but with a clear-eyed understanding of exactly what was taken and exactly what was not. Mark did not return after the trial. He relocated to another state and remarried 2 years later. The divorce was finalized in the spring of 2022. Jason spent nearly a year working his way back to his mother after learning the full truth of what had been done to her. He has spoken about that period with considerable honesty. He said he will spend a long time making that right, and that he is not certain he ever fully will. Michelle never doubted her mother for a single day. She said that watching Carol fight that fight alone, dismissed, disbelieved, and still methodical, was the most impressive thing she has ever seen anyone do. Carol sold what remained of the business in early 2022. She moved to a smaller house closer to Michelle. She began volunteering with a financial literacy organization that works with women who have experienced economic abuse, a category that researchers say is more widespread and more underreported than most people know. She talks about what happened with a directness that surprises people who expect her to still be broken by it. She is not broken. She is different in ways she would not have chosen, but she is not broken. She said something that has stayed with me since I first heard it, and I want to give it to you, in her words. She said, "The hardest part is not the money, and it is not even the marriage. The hardest part is learning to trust your own perception again, learning to believe that what you see is real." Because she took that from me too. She made me doubt my own eyes. And getting that back took longer than all the rest of it combined. What Diane did has a name. Researchers who study financial abuse and betrayal trauma call the combination of tactics she deployed covert relational aggression, in which harm is delivered not through violence or obvious cruelty, but through intimacy, through closeness, through the accumulated trust of decades. The weapon was not hatred. The weapon was love. The access that came with love. The knowledge of every vulnerability, every crack in the foundation, every fear whispered in the dark between 2 women who believed they were each other's safest person. Diane took all of that knowledge and all of that access, and she turned them into tools. And she used those tools with a patience and a precision and a coldness that the people who knew both women still struggle to reconcile with the woman they thought they understood. I want to bring you back to where this story began. That hospital room. Those flowers. That hand being held. Diane weeping at a bedside while $87,000 moved through a wire transfer on her phone. 2 things happening simultaneously in the same body. The performance of love and the reality of theft, occupying the same moment, wearing the same face. I have spent a long time thinking about what that image means. And the conclusion I keep arriving at is this. The most dangerous betrayals in any person's life are almost never the ones that arrive with warning. They are the ones that arrive wearing warmth, that feel like loyalty right up until the moment they do not, that come from the person who has been in the room for every version of your life, who knows exactly which door to walk through and exactly when to walk through it, because you opened every door for her yourself. Carol did not fail. Carol loved. And the tragedy of her story, the part that stays with me most, is that her love was real, and it was used against her as a weapon, and it worked for 26 months, and even now, even after the trial and the verdict and the years of rebuilding, she will tell you that she does not regret having loved Diane. She regrets that Diane was not who she appeared to be. Those are two different things. And understanding the difference between them is, Carol says, the most important work she has done in the years since. If this story moved you tonight, if it made you think about trust and friendship and the quiet ways that the people we love most are sometimes the people we should have questioned more carefully, I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what stayed with you. Tell me what this story made you feel. And if you have walked through something like this yourself, something you carried quietly because the person who hurt you was someone you loved, I want you to know that your story matters and that what happened to you was not your fault. The next story coming to this channel will take you even deeper into what happens when the betrayal does not come from a friend, but from inside the walls of your own family. Stay close. You will not want to miss it.